It's my great honor and pleasure to introduce Aaron Sloman from the University of Birmingham, who was Professor for Artificial Intelligence and Cognitive Science from 1991 to 2001, and is since honorary professor for those same subjects, continuing his research. In 2020, he received the K. John Barwise Prize from the American Philosophical Association for significant and sustained contributions to areas relevant to philosophy and computing. His work on AI and cognitive science is informed by a long-standing interest in the philosophy of mathematics, beginning with his dissertation on Immanuel Kant. And more recently, he's been working on a project on the evolution of biological information processing, which is at least in part inspired by the late Alan Turing's paper on the chemical basis of morphogenesis. Let me just very briefly say something about the origin of today's event. About 2 months ago, we had the opening event of the Friedrich von Weizsäcker-Center, where Aaron made a highly suggestive remark about the failure of current AI research and cognitive science in explaining spatial and topological abilities in both human and non-human animals. And that is part of the topic of his lecture today. And before I give the words to Aaron, let me just say one word about procedure. So we originally scheduled today's lecture for about 60 minutes, and I think we should stick with that. And consequently, the discussion session afterwards will perhaps be a little shorter than originally scheduled due to our delay. But we will have a brief break after the lecture, and then we'll have time for questions, clarifications, criticisms, and discussions. Okay, thank you very much. And now, without further ado, I'll give the floor to Aaron.
Right. Well, I've just sent you a link which you can later post somewhere that will enable people to see the stuff that I had prepared, which is actually quite chaotic, but it has quite a lot of detail. And I had hoped to get it into better shape by today than I've managed. Part of the problem is I'm trying to talk about stuff that I've been working on since around about 1959, and there's a lot of it. That year was the year that I was a graduate student in Oxford doing mathematics, and I had friends who were philosophers. I'd got interested in philosophy partly as a result. Before I went to Oxford, I was at Cape Town University. I used to go to meetings of the Students' Christian Society in order to contradict what I thought were all the false statements being made. And one of the people there was a graduate student in philosophy who he himself was a Christian, but we got on extremely well. And he said to me, I think you better read some more philosophy. So he lent me Bertrand Russell's book, A History of Western Philosophy. And I read that and thought it was the greatest. Russell must be the greatest philosopher who ever lived. That's I got that impression from reading his book. But whether that was correct or not, I also found that Russell made claims about Immanuel Kant and Immanuel Kant's view of mathematics. And to me, it felt as if Kant was right and Russell was wrong. So although I thought Russell was a great philosopher, I thought Kant had beaten him as far as mathematics was concerned. But then later, when I went to Oxford and I joined philosophy societies as a graduate math student, I met philosophy graduate students, several of whom became famous later. I won't bother now with names. And I found that they tended to agree with Russell that Kant had been refuted. And basically, there were a number of key points on which they all agreed. One was that Einstein's general theory of relativity had shown that, and Eddington's experiments in 1919 with the solar eclipse, which indicated that light coming past the sun towards the Earth had been bent. That supported a view that space could be curved, and in effect it wasn't Euclidean. And so the general conclusion amongst many people then was that Kant's views had been refuted, And I thought, this is silly. Kant made a lot of very important statements about a kind of space. And the fact that some parts of physical space we live in are not of that kind doesn't change whatever Kant thought he was saying. Whether he thought it was true of all space or not doesn't matter. The point is he was talking about a type of space which had these features and it had these Euclidean properties. And he was talking about how we can make discoveries about that sort of space. And what Kant said rang bells with me. Now, that was partly because when I grew up and was at school in the early 1950s, I was taught Euclidean geometry in school. Now, I wish I had a way of finding out how many people attending this thing were taught Euclidean geometry, namely learned to use diagrams to prove things. It used to be a standard part of mathematical education, but during the 20th century, partly because of work of Hilbert and Russell and Frege and Peano and other people, there was a group of mathematicians who thought all that old stuff using diagrams has been proved to be spurious. And the way to do mathematics is to use symbolic methods, to write down axioms, to use logical inferences, to have rules for manipulating your symbols. And this was particularly associated with a French school, philosophical mathematical school called Bourbaki. It was the name of a mythical mathematician. Anyway, their, how should I put it, their religion about mathematics sort of spread worldwide. And as a result, I started learning that young kids at school were being taught set theory instead of geometry, which I thought was crazy. I don't know how many people in this room. Oh, is there any way of taking votes or something? I suppose no simple way to find if, okay, Marcel, if some people are saying yes, clicking, yeah, a number of people have clicked yes. Well, that's probably, and hands are going up. So a fan, I can't see everybody on my screen at the moment, but enough to show that I'm not the only person, and Marcel is not the only person, only other person, because I know he knows what I'm talking about. Anyway, so what we learned by learning geometry was that you can discover things by drawing diagrams and reasoning about them. And I'm going to try a little example you can probably see me in a small window along with all the others. I don't know quite how this thing is set up. I've gone into gallery view and I'm seeing lots of people. You may or may not have a view where I'm taking up much of the screen. Is that what most people would have now? Speaker in the middle. Okay. In that case, you can see that I'm holding a pencil in front of my face, right? And one of the students at Sussex University, when I was teaching philosophy, went to become a school teacher. And then one day she knocked on my door and asked if we could talk. I was delighted to see her because she's a bright student and I'd like her. And she said she'd been teaching students a standard way of proving a theorem. The theorem is that if you have a triangle, the three angles of a triangle add up to a straight line. I wonder how many people have met a proof of that theorem. Anyway, there is a standard proof where you draw a triangle and then you take one of the sides, you draw another line parallel to that side, and you talk about angles being equal and so on. And Mary said, I've got a different proof. She said to me, here's my proof. If the triangle is however it is in space, I put something on the one side, and then I can rotate that, say, through one of the angles, and then I can rotate it through the second angle, then I can rotate it through the third angle, and get back to the original side. And it doesn't matter what shape or size the triangle is, I can always do that. First side and angle, second side and angle, third side and angle, and it'll always do that. In other words, those three rotations add up to a straight line, 180 degrees from there to there. And I thought it was a beautiful proof. Some time ago, I posted this onto a mathematics discussion list and discovered that some people were very angry and just argued this couldn't possibly be an acceptable proof. And later it turned out that a mathematician in Italy or France, I forget where, a couple of 100 years ago had discovered that proof, and they had the same debate there. Anyway, as far as I'm concerned, that is a proof in the sense that I want to talk about, that there are things we can do with bits of space and things in space that demonstrate something that has to be the case. And if you've understood what you've seen, you in some sense understand why it has to be the case. Another sort of trivial example, if you can see a pair of interlocking rings and you can see that they're solid and impenetrable, and you can then see that no matter how they're moved around, there's no mere motion that will separate them. You can separate them if you can break open one of the rings. But if they remain linked, then they've got to, if they remain solid and impenetrable, then they've got to remain linked, no matter how they're moved around, whether you take them to the top of Mount Everest or bury them deep in or whatever. So these are a couple of examples of what we can think of as an ability that humans have to someone told me I may use the raise hand function. Okay, I just saw the chat message. I told everybody you can do it. Anyway, an ability that humans have to think about spatial structures and processes, and then to discover things that have to be a certain way. This does not mean that our processes are infallible. We can make mistakes. And the history of mathematics, including the history of geometry, has some famous mistakes. Some of you may know the work of Imre Lakatos, in which he, in a book called Proofs and Refutations, in which he went through the history of a proof by Euler of a theorem about polyhedra. I won't go into the details, but the point is he gave a proof, and his proof involved spatial reasoning. You start with a polyhedron and you cut open a face, you stretch it out and you do things. And then people started finding counterexamples. You could have a polyhedron which meets the definition of a polyhedron. It's made of, for instance, a cube with a tunnel going through it, which has got flat surfaces. So you've got an outer cube, and then this inner rectangle has been removed. And that's still a polyhedron according to a definition of a polyhedron, as a solid bounded by plane surfaces. Just in this case, some of the plane surfaces are inside other plane surfaces. Anyway, Euler's proof broke down for that and other things. But various things were done as a result. And in the history of mathematics, you get things like that being discovered, and then various changes can happen. You can change the definition. You can change the definition of polyhedron to rule out that kind of thing and say, no, it's got to be totally convex. Or you can change your conclusion and say, instead of the formula being V equals E plus 2, you can say, we've got a family of different formulae for different classes of polyhedra. So mathematics is a dynamic, changing, growing subject as people explore spatial structures and other structures, logical structures, mathematical structures, proof theoretic structures, and they discover things about them. And when they discover them, it's different from going out and holding something and discovering that when you let go, it falls. That is something that you couldn't work out just by reasoning about it, that it's got to go that way rather than that way or when you let go. So there are things that in some sense have three features, and this was a point that Immanuel Kant made, that when you've understood them, you can see that the things that are true of these examples are necessarily true or necessarily false. There's necessity and impossibility. And that's characteristic of a lot of mathematical discoveries. And a second feature depends on a second distinction that he made, and these distinctions were partly in response to what David Hume had said about kinds of knowledge, which I'll come back to in a minute. The second feature that you can have is that some things are true because of the way the symbols have been defined and the way they're put together in the logical structure of a sentence. So a typical example of that would be if you've got a word in English, bachelor, which is defined to mean a male unmarried person, then you can, from that and various other definitions, conclude that no bachelor uncle is an only child. So if somebody's a bachelor and an uncle, it can't be an only child. How do you work that out? Well, you look at the definition of bachelor, it's not married. You look at the definition of uncle, someone's an uncle if either he has a brother or sister who's got a child, then he's the uncle of that child, or he's got a wife and the wife has a brother or sister who's got a child. You can be the uncle of through your spouse as well as through your own siblings. But if we've started off with the definition that it's a bachelor uncle, then he can't have a wife, and then from that you can't be a bachelor if he's got a child. Sorry, I think my example went out of control there, but you can work it out in your own time. And a bachelor uncle must have a brother or sister is the conclusion. Now, that is done using only logic and definitions. It can be quite tortuous and unobvious, but there are things we can learn using logic and definitions. And Immanuel Kant called those things analytic. And he contrasted them with things that were synthetic, where you have to do something different. And the things that you can do that are different may be of the empirical kind. You have to go and do experiments and see what happens if you're holding something and you let go and you find it goes that way, not that way. Well, that's empirical. You couldn't just work it out. So things may be analytic or synthetic. They may be empirical, or you can get them by reasoning, or they're not empirical. Or the third thing is they may be necessary or contingent. So you may discover that a lot of things are true of examples, and then you may find that having generalized from those examples, you may conclude that everything of that sort has to be like the examples you found so far. For example, you may conclude that every solid that you put on water has to sink because you have lots of solids that sink. And then you find a new solid, namely a log made of wood, and you put it in water and it doesn't sink. Or you even find some ice and put it in water and it doesn't sink. So then you've discovered that the original claim that everything you put in water sinks, every solid that you put in water sinks, is false. That's empirical. So there's three distinctions. The empirical, where you have to go and test and observe and see what happens, and versus non-empirical, where you can find out by reasoning. Then there's a second one where you can do your reasoning purely by logic and definitions, or not. So that's the analytic synthetic distinction. And then the third one is that what you discover may be something that cannot have exceptions. It's necessarily true in all possible cases, or it's contingently true. You may just have found a special case. And Kant made those distinctions separate. And as far as I know, nobody before Kant had made them separate. Anyway, it seemed to me, yes, this is exactly how we have to understand mathematics. Mathematical discoveries in the necessary contingent distinction come out on the necessary side. In the analytic synthetic distinction, there are some that are analytic, they're just true by definition, but the deep ones are all non-analytic. You have to go beyond logic and definitions. And the third, what have I got? Necessary contingent, analytic synthetic, and empirical a priori. And as he pointed out, saying that it's a priori doesn't mean you're born with it. It means that when you work it out, it's not by going around and looking at how things are in the world, because once you've understood how it's got to be, you don't have to look for all examples in the world. So it's not empirical. Three distinctions: empirical a priori, analytic synthetic, necessary contingent. And as far as I know, this stuff of Kant is no longer taught in philosophy courses. I meet philosophers who don't seem to be familiar with that. I hope it's taught and I'm just wrong, but that's an impression I get, that it isn't. And I think insofar as it isn't, it's because a lot of philosophers, and I suspect the great majority of the analytically minded philosophers, hard-headed, clear-thinking philosophers, were convinced by people like Carl Hempel and others that Kant's views had been refuted by Einstein's general theory of relativity and the observations of the eclipse that showed that Einstein was right, because they thought that Kant was claiming that everything had to be Euclidean. There's no exception. Well, if Kant was claiming that, that was a mistake. He was nearly right. He should have said there are things that are Euclidean, and when we look at them, we can make these discoveries which involve necessity, not contingency, and they're not just logic and analytic and analysis. They're reasoning about structures and relationships between structures. Okay, so that's some historical background. And over many years, I thought I would be able to defend Kant by showing how to build a robot using AI. I got into AI around 1967 or 1969, I think it was. And I started learning to program. I was then a young lecturer in philosophy at the University of Sussex. And one of the leading AI researchers in vision, the guy called Max Clues, who unfortunately died a few years later, he came there, we became friends, and I learned to program through him. And through him, I was stimulated to go and give a talk at a conference in 1971, AI conference, where I criticized what was then an important movement in AI, which said everything can be done using logic. If you want to build our robots, we have to give them logical abilities, and provided they have a rich and complete version of logic, which was defined as predicate calculus with some extra stuff put in. It was argued in a paper by John McCarthy, one of the great pioneers of artificial intelligence, and Pat Hayes, who was then a PhD student. They wrote a paper, McCarthy and Hayes, 1969, claiming that an intelligent robot will be able to do everything just using logic, but logic, a rich enough logic. And I thought, no, because that would not accommodate these ancient proofs in geometry that I had encountered, and about which Kant had talked, and I thought Kant was right. And so I argued at this conference that we need to find ways of extending the ability of robots so they don't just use logic and the kinds of reasoning that John McCarthy talks about. I spent quite a long time trying to find ways of giving machines that extra kind of ability and not really succeeding. And eventually, after quite a long time, partly stimulated by the Turing centenary in 2012, it was 100 years after Alan Turing was born, there were celebrations. Some of you may have been involved in conferences and workshops celebrating the Turing centenary. I got invited to contribute to a book, a commemorative book, which was published by Elsevier. It came out a year late, but it had a lot of papers by Turing, each followed by commentaries and so on. And I had a misunderstanding with the editor who had invited me to contribute some stuff. And as a result of the misunderstanding, I looked at one of the papers in that collection, which was written by Turing, published in 1952, called The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis. Bits of my brain are dying, and that was an example. You see things of that happening. So I'm hoping that younger people will be able to take over what I'm doing before it's all gone. Anyway, Turing wrote this paper, The Chemical Basis of Morphogenesis, and I somehow had the impression I was expected to comment on that, and that was a misunderstanding, but I looked at the paper anyway. I wonder how many people have ever read this paper or know of its existence. Well, I won't go through the voting system, but in this paper, he discusses what can happen if you have two liquids moving through a surface, a two-dimensional surface, where they diffuse at different rates. That's chemical, physical property of each liquid. And when they meet, either one of them will inhibit the other in some sense. Let's not worry about what that means. And when that happens, that will depend on the relative concentrations of the chemicals. And he showed that if you had these two chemicals with these differences diffusing through liquids, then depending on the conditions, you could get a huge variety of two-dimensional patterns forming. You could get collections of stripes, you could get blobs, you could get spirals and other things. And I thought, why is Alan Turing writing about patterns on the surface of things? And for a while, that became his most highly cited paper, because although philosophers didn't know about it, physicists, chemists, and mathematicians thought it was a wonderful paper because it was, you know, a lot of deep and clever stuff, and actually inspired work in biology. But I was suspicious. I thought, he's really doing this on the way to something else. And then I remembered that in the 1950 paper, the one that in which he introduced what's wrongly called the Turing test, he called it the imitation game. In that paper, there's one sentence where he says, in brains, chemistry is at least as important as electricity, but he didn't say why. And somehow that, I went back and checked, and that sentence was there, or something like those words. And I thought, Turing is trying to use chemistry to explain intelligence. And on the way, he made this discovery about 2D patterns, and it was nice, very nice piece of mathematics, relevant to biology, and he's published it, and it got a lot of attention, and it's still being referred to and much admired. But I thought, and I put this conjecture into a paper for that volume, he was really on his way to something much deeper and more general about kinds of thinking mechanisms, ways brains might work, which involves chemistry and not just digital circuits and switches going on and off and electricity, and with the properties of the sorts of digital computers that you get in his time, mythical computers, Turing machines and so on. But soon after that, computers based on transistors and other digital machines. Anyway, so I thought, maybe I have to give up my claim that we can implement ancient mathematical minds like Pythagoras and Euclid and Archimedes and all those people in digital computers. We may need chemical computers. And I started trying to understand why that might be the case and what you might be able to do with chemical computers. And that led into trying to find out what was known about chemistry and biology. And over the years, that was about 2012, so it's about 9 years, I started finding that more and more stuff had to be done that linked chemistry and biology. And of course, there's enormously spectacular stuff that started back with Watson and Crick and Rosalind Franklin, whose work led to the discovery of the structure of DNA, the double helix. And there's earlier work by the physicist Schrödinger, book in 1944, What is Life, which was related to that, but only in a loose way. Watson had read that book, and he claimed that Schrödinger's book had partly inspired him when he did his work, later work on the double helix. But Schrödinger's book when I went to look at it, had some interesting things about why life depended on quantum mechanics and would not have been possible without quantum phenomena. And he was mainly talking about how it's possible to have chemical structures. By then it was known that reproduction depended on chemical, long, complex, more or less linear molecules, which could be reproduced faithfully across generations. He was saying, well, I mean, I don't know exactly how his thought processes went, but if you think about anything you know about Newtonian physics, in Newton, you've got particles and they can bump into one another. They can have elastic collisions. They can also, something can push something away. They can also perhaps be stretched, and then when you release them, they go back. But what you can't do in Newtonian mechanics is have two particles come together and then stick together. There's nothing in Newtonian physics which says under these conditions, things will join together and then be rigidly held. For that, you need quantum mechanics, as Schrödinger was claiming in this book. And that is connected with the fact that chemistry, where bonds form and can be released, involve quantum mechanisms. And in particular, you can have bonds forming and being released under the influence of catalysts. So you can have things that are highly stable, which is what you want for a lot of biological information structures. But when you want to do things like separating them, you can separate them without trouble if you have catalytic processes which remove the bonds and so on. And that's only possible in quantum physics. So cutting a long story short, this led me to think there may be more to quantum physics and its features than just the relevance to reproduction. It may also be relevant to how brains work and reasoning processes, and perhaps there are forms of computation. At that point, I didn't know that Turing had written in 1936 that the digital computers, this I think was in his thesis, his words are something like this: digital computers can exhibit ingenuity, but not intuition. Mathematical ingenuity, but not mathematical intuition. He didn't, in that thing, say what he meant by ingenuity and intuition, and he didn't explain why they couldn't do it. But it occurred to me that perhaps he was using the ingenuity versus intuition contrast to say something about mechanical processes, which are very complicated and lots of discrete things. Those would be examples of ingenuity. And then there are other kinds of processes where you have insight into what is and isn't possible and reason about it in some other way. And that would be intuition. And if he was saying that the discrete digital computers can only do one of those, not the others, and thinking, but I can do both. I'm a mathematician. I can reason about these geometrical spatial structures in an intuitive way. He might have been wondering how one can explain how brains do that by thinking about chemical processes, which can support a combination of discrete operations, which Schrödinger said were crucial for life, namely the quantum switches that form bonds and release bonds and so on. And they can also, chemical things can also get involved in continuous changes, namely they can fold and move together and apart and twist and do all sorts of things, which we know are essential for reproduction. That combination that Schrödinger was writing about is essential for reproduction. So I began to think, well, maybe it's also essential for how brains work. And can I find ways of describing brain mechanisms that could lie behind the kind of mathematical intuition and insight that was needed to explain the ancient discoveries in geometry and topology that I think Immanuel Kant was talking about, and I think had correctly described. I have no idea whether Turing ever read Kant or knew that he was saying anything remotely like what Kant had said. I suspect not, because my feeling is he would have acknowledged the connection if he had recognized this as a Kantian view. So my feeling is that Kant and Turing separately reached the same conclusion, that there are these two ways of thinking, one of which involves these purely discrete, logic-like, algebraic-like operations. And then there are others where you can reason, thinking about what can and can't be done in continuous spaces and so on. Anyway, so having thought that there might be that link between Turing and Kant and different kinds of ways of doing mathematics, I started what I called the Metamorphogenesis Project, inspired by Turing's ideas and so on. And I started writing papers of various sorts. And this has just gone on. Some of them have been published. The part of what I have just said was in that book commemorating Turing that was published a year after the Turing centenary. But then there was another collection of papers where I took the idea that I've just mentioned and elaborated it a bit more, and that was published. But every time I publish anything, it's out of date by the time it's published, because all these ideas are scrambling around in my brain and generating new offshoots all the time. And I just want to keep going back and working on what I've already got and extending it, not saying, here's a publication, okay, that's done. So this talk is a kind of example, and I'm still only near the beginning, example of is reporting on a collection of examples of things that I've been thinking about that all come out of those strands that I've been telling you about in Kant and Turing and biology and digital computers and different kinds of patterns of interaction and so on. And what's been happening recently, the question now is how to do this without having my diagrams. What's been happening recently is that I've been thinking about starting from what Schrödinger talked about, namely reproduction, which starts by duplicating the DNA strand, but thinking more about what happens after that. And the more I read about developmental biology, the more complex it became. I mean, the early stages where you just, you have these two DNA strands, they get unraveled, and then various bits of chemistry in the cell happen, and you may get more copies of DNA, and cells start splitting and so on. But as an organism starts developing more and more parts in an egg or in a womb or in a seed, they become differentiated, and that's pretty obvious. I mean, you have plants with roots and trunks and branches and leaves and flowers, and different parts have different functions, and there are things going up and the whole tree trunk that take stuff up from the roots, water, for example, and then other things that can come down. The leaves do photosynthesis, and that generates stuff that can come down. Anyway, I'm just taking trees as one example, but in animals, there's a lot more, because there are not only these parts that do different things, they can keep moving around relative to each other, as my hands are doing all the time. Various parts of my mouth and tongue and so on are moving parts relative to one another. And so we have to have inside a developing organism, various bits being produced, which are related to other bits in increasingly complex and diverse ways. So you're not just getting more and more of the same. You can, for some kinds of reproduction, there are interesting things. I don't know how many people have heard of slime mold. It's a kind of organism that if you put it on a surface and give it various obstacles on that surface, and then perhaps some places where there are food, this slime mold spreads itself out as if it's exploring bits of the surface. And if some bits find the food, then the other bits sort of shrink back into the core, and then they go out to where the food is and so on. And that's an example of a type of chemical control that's being studied by biochemists, biologists. In fact, we may have some people at this meeting from one of the labs that's doing that kind of work, whose work I've come across recently. Mike Levin and I've temporarily forgotten the name of the university. It's not important now. So the question then is, given that we can see that there are examples of biological stuff that involves shape changing and various kinds of control, how much of what's known can be put together to explain how you make a human or a horse or a chicken? And for quite a long time, I've been trying to understand what we can get out of this. And I have web pages which produce partial reports. One of the ideas that came out was that any newly reproducing organism starts off with chemical stuff, which provides a kind of construction kit that can do things. But it's clear that as it becomes more complex, it needs to create new construction kits to make new kinds of stuff. For instance, bones and sinews, blood vessels, or whatever, or leaves and bark and whatever. And these kinds of construction kits are going to get increasingly complex, and also they will have to be coordinated to perform tasks together. So you have construction kits composed of construction kits. So we'll have to have construction kits for building construction kits that manage construction kits. And I'm claiming that that can go on in a highly evolved complex organism that starts as a fertilized egg and then becomes a human or a horse or a chicken or a complex animal. But of course, in evolutionary history, billions of years ago, the organisms would have been much simpler and the construction kits would have been much simpler, although the basic building blocks were the same physics, same fundamental physics. Anyway, the thinking about that led in a variety of different directions about what must have changed over the course of evolution, and also what must have changed over the course of development of individuals, which in some ways will correspond to what has previously changed in the course of evolution, in the sense that producing a complex modern animal will require construction kits to be built that did not exist in the earlier stages of evolution, where you were producing much simpler organisms. But that raises all sorts of horrible questions about where these construction kits are and how they get built. And I've been spending the last few years finding out all kinds of different things about biology and reproduction and chemistry and biochemistry and whatever, and seeing where I can fit that into the things that I've been writing and putting on these web pages. Until something happened very recently, and I can't remember exactly what triggered it. Oh yes, I can. I was at a conference. It was a philosophy conference and people were talking about quantum physics and things. And someone raised a question and the speaker answered and talked about things that go on in quantum physics. And it occurred to me, for some reason, I don't know why, that eggs must be a counterexample of what he'd said. Because of what I knew and what everybody knows about eggs and the way things come out of them that are very different from what they have in their start with. After that meeting, I went away and thought, hang on, I've never thought of that before. And in particular, what I had never thought about before is that there are some cases where what goes on inside an egg completely enclosed in an eggshell, produces something that when it comes out, namely a chick or a duckling or a turtle or a alligator, there are all sorts of animals that develop inside eggs, but when they are ready to come out, they break open the eggshell, they come out, they get themselves out, and then they start doing things in the environment. I've known that for years. You've all known it for years. But it has deep implications. It means that the competences that they use, the chick when it sees the stuff, the seeds on the lying on the ground or whatever, or the places where it can drink, or what I saw last night on a BBC program, and I was going to show you a snippet of. Maybe later we can set up a website with this stuff available. They showed there's a species of bird, I think they were avocets, and they showed a collection of these hatching out of eggs. So they come out of their eggs, and then they go and sit under their mother for a while, and then the mother goes towards a river where there's water, and these little creatures that she's got with her follow her, and then they get into the water, and then they swim around, and they dive and catch food. They have not had any opportunity since coming out of the egg to be trained to do any of that. They've not had any opportunity to have their neural nets rewired by lots of trials succeeding and failing and then changing weights and so on. They came out of the egg with the competence to produce that behavior already there, because they didn't get it in sitting under their mother while she was keeping them warm, or they didn't get it while they were walking along the riverbank to get into the water. And similar remarks can be made about a lot of animals that do things when they come out of eggs, which they don't have to learn to do by lots of trial and error. It's built in. And as it happens, I think you can say a lot of similar things about animals that don't grow in eggs. For example, the sucking behavior of a very young human child requires complex coordination of muscles around the mouth and tongue and so on. And it can be quite difficult to get an airtight gap and to be able to suck properly with a human nipple. I remember noticing that it was much easier for our child when he was given a rubber artificial nipple with water or milk or whatever, than when he was getting the real stuff. And I wondered what that had to do with intellectual development, because he was having to learn more complex control processes, as a newborn child, but not learning from nothing, because there's an awful lot of control already in there in the attempts to latch on and suck. Anyway, that's the human example, but there are much more spectacular examples of these birds. And I was about to say another mammal, not a human, but many of you probably already know that there are horses and deer. These are four-legged mammals that run. They get eaten by other animals, and one of the reasons they need to be able to run is so as not to be eaten. They can walk around. They can also find food, which is not other animals, but vegetation, which they eat. But there are things that eat them. So if a new baby horse, deer, foal is born, it has four legs, but its mother can't pick it up and carry it if she has to run because they're being attacked by a tiger or something. So this foal has to be able to use its four legs to run at speed with its mother and all the other animals in the herd. And it has to be ready to do that within a few hours of coming out of the womb. So what I'm saying about eggs and animals coming out of eggs also applies to this fowl. There's no way that it could have all the competences that are required to run, to keep its balance, to jump over rocks and other things, to avoid obstacles. It couldn't have done all that after coming out of the mother's womb. It didn't get the practice, didn't train its brain. The abilities to do that must somehow have come out of the genome while it was inside its mother. So for some reason, I noticed that many years ago, but it didn't have the same effect on me as thinking about eggs did a couple of months ago, which sort of transformed everything. And when I say a couple of months, time flies. I think it was November or December that the thought about chickens' eggs hit me. And since then, I've been talking to as many people as I can about chicks and eggs, including Marcel, who and how this might relate to Kant's views of mathematics, because it may imply that the mechanisms that enable these species that get born with spatial competences that are assembled inside the egg, which means they have to be assembled by chemical processes that are building the thing, that it's not assembled by training neural nets on examples. Those chemical processes might be responsible for far more kinds of things that brains can do than we have thought about. And it may well be that a great deal of human intelligence depends not on bits of the brain that have been trained by lots of examples being shown with successes and failures and weights being adjusted on connections. And one reason for thinking that what I've just said must be true of brains is that what Immanuel Kant said about mathematics is incompatible with the claim that mathematical competences have to be acquired by lots of adjustments with examples. In other words, that would make it empirical learning. He was claiming, and I completely agreed, that there are kinds of insight that you can get that come from some kind of ability to grasp structural relationships, and the way that even a child can grasp the relationship between two solid rings that are linked, like the rings that I've made in my finger, to realize that as long as neither of them opens up and they keep their shape, there's no way that just merely moving them around can make them become separate. It's an impossible transition. So this notion that there are things that are possible when the conditions are specified, or impossible, and that possibility or impossibility has to do with the structure of space, not to do with derivations of logical symbols, and not to do with collecting data and working out probabilities. That is something, the ability to recognize those things and to make use of them is something we need to explain in humans and other animals. And if we want to get machines to be intelligent in the way that humans, and I'm now going to say squirrels and chimpanzees and many other intelligent animals are, they can see what is and isn't possible in a situation and take appropriate action. And that's why it's so hard to produce squirrel-proof bird feeders. I don't know how many of you have come across the YouTube phenomenon of squirrels and bird feeders. There are many people who buy bird feeders that are supposed to defeat squirrels, because squirrels realize that there are nuts inside the bird feeders and they like the same nuts as the birds like. So for example, one that is somewhere on YouTube is a bird feeder that has the nuts in the center, and then around the nuts is a frame on which birds can come perch and peck at the nuts that are in this tube that it's got holes in the side where they can get it. They can get at the nuts. But if a squirrel climbs up or jumps onto this frame. The squirrel's heavier than the bird. That presses the frame down, that turns on a switch and an electric motor, and that spins the frame around, and the squirrel gets thrown off. So the people who designed that advertised it as a squirrel-proof bird feeder. Have any of you seen this on, well, I can't see your responses, but the video I found showed a squirrel trying to get nuts, and exactly as planned by the designer, it was thrown off, but a lot of nuts were also thrown off. So the next thing that happened was that the squirrel came back onto this bird feeder and hung on to the frame. And while it hung on, it was whirled round and round, and nuts went flying out. And then the squirrel went down and ate the nuts off the ground. Now, a squirrel working something like that out from that previous experience is totally different from something being trained by lots and lots of examples with more reward and punishment. It's being able to discover that something is possible, and the combinations of possibilities produce other possibilities. And if you get the combination right, then you can achieve a result that you wanted to achieve in the first place, which you couldn't do by just climbing on and eating the nuts, but you could do by this other means. And there are squirrel obstacle courses which show how ingenious they can be at defeating things that they encounter for the first time. They don't have to go through long training processes like the artificial neural nets do. Anyway, what I'm disparaging now is a vast industry in AI of claiming, well, built on the implicit claim that the way to make intelligent systems is to use artificial neural nets based on this inaccurate theory about how intelligent animals' brains work, namely the theory that they learn everything empirically and discover the conditions under which things do and don't work. And since it's all done empirically, all they can ever discover is probabilities. They can't, by that means, discover that something is impossible or necessarily the case. Whereas, as Kant had pointed out, if human brains can make discoveries about things that are impossible or necessarily the case, and if we can find out how that works, we may be able to give our machines that kind of ability. Now, that aim was the aim that John McCarthy, whom I mentioned earlier, and Patrick Hayes and various other people in AI had, and that was why they were trying to build logic-based theorem provers. So they were building a counter to neural net theory before the neural net theory even took off in AI. Sorry, it's not true. There were people even as far back as the mid-1960s, Asriel Rosenfeld, for instance, who were trying to train pattern recognizers in machines using statistical mechanisms. But that was not the same as training them to solve problems. It was training them to classify objects. Anyway, I hope all these threads that I'm bringing together are not so tangled that nobody's being able to follow what I'm saying, but I'll just come back a couple of steps then. So I'm saying there's evidence, and I've given you examples of evidence, that evolution has produced ways in which brains of animals can do intelligent things. And there's also evidence that not all of it depends on logic, although some of it clearly does. I mean, humans can use logic and algebra and discrete forms of reasoning, symbolic reasoning, and that is a major part of computer systems engineering, computer programming, as well as physics, mathematics, chemistry, and so on. But in addition, there is something else, and the question now is, can we talk about what that something else is? Can we replicate it? Can we find out how it works? And I will try to, how long have I been going on for?
About 60 minutes.
About 60, okay. So we're getting to the point where I thought probably it would be time for a break, and I will end by making a few remarks about possible ways forward. Now, how do I do this? I think if we can try to get a deeper understanding of what can and can't be done by chemistry, if we can get a deeper understanding of how many different kinds of stages there are where in development, say, of a chick inside an egg, or any embryo, complex embryo, take any vertebrate, for instance, but maybe even insects. For instance, very complex things happen when a caterpillar has been chewing leaves and so on, and then goes into a pupa, and then later a butterfly comes out, or a moth or something. Completely different structure, completely different behaviors. That all must be based on chemistry that was there all along, somehow being used in two different ways. One, to make the caterpillar and let it get all the food it needs to build up its mass. And then chemistry takes charge and changes everything and produces something different that uses the matter that's been built up by eating. But anyway, going back to the egg, my claim is that the production of something as complicated as a chicken entirely enclosed in its egg must have multiple stages where the complexity of what has to be done keeps changing, obviously, because there are more parts to be coordinated. Not only are there more of them, they're more different in their functions. There are some parts which are solid and rigid, like bones and so on. There are others which are flexible, like muscles and sinews and so on. There are some that are conduits for signals, like nerves and so on. There's some that are conduits for blood vessels. And some of those are for taking blood with oxygen and nutrients and so on to places where they're needed. And then other blood vessels are for taking the waste products back. So it's the difference between arteries and veins. So all these different components are made of different kinds of stuff with different physical properties and different functions, having to be assembled in parallel in ways that all make the right kind of sense given what's going to happen later, not just at each stage working correctly. It seems to me that for that to happen, there must be control and coordination mechanisms which get more and more complicated as the organism that's been built gets more and more complicated. So getting from a very complicated stage to an even more complicated stage is going to need a more complicated control subsystem. So the hunch was that evolution discovered something that we've discovered, but we've discovered it only very recently, and evolution discovered it long ago. And what we've discovered is that you can have sophisticated virtual machines doing things, taking control decisions, and changing what they do while running on physical hardware that doesn't change. And an example is a Zoom meeting. We have a Zoom meeting here. People can join, people can leave. All kinds of things can change when it's working, which didn't happen for me today, but I could switch to displaying videos or then doing something else. Different people can be talking, but the underlying physical stuff that's in your network and power supplies and on the internet connections that you have doesn't have to be constantly rewired when new connections are set up. It's done using virtual machines. And the concept of virtual machine that I'm using here is highly sophisticated and very different from the earliest virtual machines that were built in the late 1950s and 60s, which were simulated computers running on existing computers, where the simulation was for a new design for a computer, and they'd run the simulation to see if it would work as expected, because that way you could discover bugs in the design. And then gradually, bits of simulation and virtuality were added for all sorts of different functions. For instance, one of them was virtual memory, where you had fast expensive electronic digital memory, and then separately slower, cheaper memory on disks. And there was clever designs in the 1970s and thereon to allow the computer to behave as if everything was in the fast, expensive memory, but actually it was swapping between the real fast memory and the virtual memory that was on the disk. So that depended on physical structures and stuff being moved around. Anyway, later still, networks and things were developed, and then things had to happen to enable the network to go on functioning while bits broke. So things had to detect failures and reroute, and everything became more and more flexible. And now you can have whole chunks of network being phased out for repairs or whatever, maintenance, and everything continues working as before because it's just been set up so that instant rerouting can deal with the problem. And what I'm suggesting is that that kind of use of virtual machinery, where you can have the same underlying physical structure doing very different things, may have been discovered long ago by biological evolution and enabled virtual control machines of different sorts to run on the chemical structures inside the egg to build the next virtual machine to control the next layer of physical complexity. Now, I don't know yet whether that actually makes sense, but that was the idea that I was going to end with as a challenge for the future to see whether it can be made, sense can be made. And there are various things that can already be said about some of the requirements for that to work. And that might be something to talk about later on. So I've tried to take you through a long and tangled personal history for me, which I think may actually mirror some of evolution's developments that we only partly understand. And I hope many clever people in this room will help to push that understanding further. And I hope in particular that I've made you realize why the huge reliance that currently is being placed on statistically trained artificial neural nets that derive probabilities from statistics will not get us the kind of intelligence that Immanuel Kant was talking about, that Euclid and Pythagoras and Archimedes and the mathematicians, hundreds, thousands of Pythagoras' theorem was proved long before Pythagoras was born, and it's been proved in many different ways. So all of that stuff does not use the kind of probabilistic, data-driven learning that is what is now passing for artificial intelligence, which is useful. I'm not claiming it's not useful. I'm not claiming that it can have all sorts of practical applications. I'm just saying it's leaving out something deep and important that we will need if we want to have human-like or even squirrel-like intelligence in our robots. Thank you for now.